The courtroom was a tomb, and Judge Arthur Blackwell was about to seal it. His gavel was raised, ready to send a man to his death, a decision built on a mountain of cold, hard evidence. The judge, a man whose heart had turned to stone after his own wife's killer was never found, believed in facts, not feelings. But just as the gavel began its descent, a tiny voice sliced through the silence. "He's innocent." It was a 10-year-old girl. Blackwell glared down, his eyes like chips of ice. "One more word, and I will have you removed." The girl looked past the man on trial, past the jury, and stared directly into the judge's soul. "I know," she said, her voice suddenly heavy with impossible knowledge. "But I also know who killed your wife." This is just the tip of the iceberg. To find out how this impossible story ends, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what comes next. The air in courtroom 4 was thick with the ghosts of past judgments. It smelled of old leather, polished mahogany, and the faint, metallic scent of fear. High above it all, like a king surveying his domain, sat Judge Arthur Blackwell. His black robe was an armor, his face a mask of stone, and his bench was not merely a piece of furniture. It was a throne built of cold, unshakable law. From this throne, Blackwell surveyed the man who was about to have his life taken from him, Daniel Vargas. To the judge, Vargas was no longer a man. He was a file, a collection of exhibits, a loose end to be tied. Blackwell's world was a world of neat conclusions, of closed cases and absolute certainties, because the single most important case in his own life remained agonizingly open. For a fleeting moment, the sterile light of the courtroom glinted off the wedding ring on his finger, and the ghost of his wife, Eleanor, flickered in his mind. Her smile, the way she tucked a stray piece of hair behind her ear. The memory was an ambush, a sudden, sharp pain behind his ribs. Her killer had never been found. The car that struck her had vanished into the night, leaving behind nothing but a shattered life and a case file stamped cold. That failure had hollowed Arthur out, replacing his heart with a cold, precise engine of law. He couldn't find justice for his wife, so he would deliver it relentlessly and without mercy to everyone else. Daniel Vargas looked up, his face pale and defeated. He had the eyes of a man who had already accepted his fate. The jury had been convinced, the evidence was overwhelming, and the man on the throne was known for his unforgiving nature. The room was perfectly silent, every person holding their breath, waiting for the swing of the executioner's axe, which in this room took the form of a polished wooden gavel. Judge Blackwell cleared his throat, the sound echoing like a crack of thunder in the silent room. He shuffled the papers before him, a final, cold ritual before passing sentence. "Daniel Vargas," he began, his voice devoid of any emotion, a surgeon stating a fatal diagnosis. "You have been found guilty of the crime of murder in the first degree by a jury of your peers. This court has weighed the evidence presented." He paused, letting the weight of the moment crush the hope from the room. His gaze was fixed on Vargas, a predator looking at its prey. He was about to pronounce the final words, to close the file, to bring his artificial order to the chaos of another man's life. But then a sound. It was not a cough or a sob. It was a word, small but clear, cutting through the oppressive silence from the public gallery. "He's innocent." Every head in the courtroom turned. A bailiff, startled, began to move. Judge Blackwell's eyes narrowed, scanning the crowd for the source of the disruption. He found it. A child. A girl no older than 10, standing on her own, her small frame a stark contrast to the massive, intimidating columns of the courtroom. It was Lily, the defendant's niece. Blackwell's face tightened. This was his sanctuary, the one place in the universe where he had absolute control. A child's emotional outburst was a weed in his perfectly manicured garden of law. He lifted his gavel not to strike it, but to point it at her, a weapon to enforce the silence. "This is a court of law," he boomed, his voice a low growl. "One more word, and I will have you removed for contempt." The girl did not cry. She did not shrink back in fear. She simply stood her ground, her gaze locked with his. The bailiff was approaching her now, his hand outstretched. But she did not look at him. She looked only at the judge, the king on his broken throne. "I know," she said, her voice now louder, chillingly calm. "But I also know who killed your wife." The world stopped. The bailiff froze mid-step. The murmurs of the crowd died. For the first time in 20 years, the silence in Judge Arthur Blackwell's courtroom was not his own. It was a suffocating, terrifying void, and in the center of it was the impossible knowledge in a little girl's eyes. For a long second, Judge Arthur Blackwell felt the floor of his courtroom disappear from beneath him. The girl's words didn't just hang in the air, they seemed to suck all the oxygen out of the room. He felt 100 pairs of eyes shift from a girl to him, watching, waiting. They were no longer looking at a judge. They were looking at a man whose deepest wound had just been torn open in front of the world. A wave of pure, cold fury washed over him, extinguishing the initial shock. This was a trick, a desperate, disgusting ploy cooked up by the defense to force a mistrial. They were using his personal tragedy, the sacred memory of his wife, as a weapon against him. He decided in that moment that he would not allow it. He would dismantle this child's testimony with the cold steel of his logic and make an example of her that no one in this room would ever forget. He leaned forward, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous register, the voice he reserved for cornering a lying witness on the stand. "Let me be perfectly clear," he said, his words aimed at Lily but intended for the entire court. "You are making a very serious allegation, one that disrespects this court and the memory of a good woman." He paused, letting the threat sink in. "Tell me, young lady, how is it that you, a child, claim to have solved a crime that has stumped the state's best detectives for over a decade? Did you have a vision? Did a ghost whisper it in your ear?" A few nervous chuckles rippled through the gallery. The prosecutor shifted on his feet, sensing the judge was re-establishing his dominance. Blackwell felt a grim satisfaction. He would expose this for the pathetic theater it was. Lily did not answer his question. She simply stood there, her expression unchanged, as if his sarcasm was a language she didn't understand. She took a small step forward, her hands clasped behind her back. "You don't believe me about your wife," she stated, not as a question, but as a fact. "So let me tell you about Mr. Vargas." Blackwell's jaw tightened. "We are done hearing about Mr. Vargas." "You think he killed that man because his fingerprints were on the wallet," Lily continued, her voice steady and clear, easily carrying through the silent room. "But you never found the weapon. The police looked for a simple steak knife, because that's what the report said was missing from the victim's kitchen." The judge stared at her, his anger turning to cold curiosity. Everything she said was accurate, common knowledge from the trial. He remained silent, giving her the rope to hang herself. Then came the whisper of the miracle. "But it wasn't a simple steak knife," Lily said, her eyes locked on Blackwell's. "The knife he used had a little bird carved into the wooden handle, an eagle, but the tip of its wing was chipped off. It broke when he used it. The air went thin." The words meant nothing to the public in the gallery, but to Judge Blackwell, they were a detonation. He felt a jolt, as if an electric current had shot up the base of his spine. The chipped wing of the eagle. That was a detail from a single line, buried on page 87 of the confidential forensic report. A detail that had been sealed, deemed irrelevant to the case, and never, ever mentioned in open court. It was a secret known only to a handful of people on the planet. His head snapped toward the prosecutor's table. The prosecutor, a man named Harris, was staring at the girl, his face as white as a sheet. His mouth was slightly open in disbelief. Blackwell then glanced at the lead detective sitting in the front row, who was now leaning forward, his eyes wide with shock. They knew. They both knew the girl had just spoken an impossible truth. The nervous chuckles were gone. The whispers were gone. The entire courtroom was now encased in a new kind of silence, a heavy, supernatural hush. The humiliation Blackwell had intended for the girl had backfired, turning on him with devastating force. She had not been discredited. She had been authenticated. Blackwell felt a tremor in his hand. His authority, his control, his entire reality had been fractured by the words of child. He could no longer pass sentence. He could no longer breathe. He was no longer a judge. He was a man drowning in a mystery far deeper and darker than he could have ever imagined. He grabbed the gavel, his knuckles white. The sharp, cracking sound of the wood hitting the block was the sound of his world breaking. "This court is adjourned," he roared, his voice hoarse. He didn't wait for a response. He stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, and stormed from the bench, his black robe billowing behind him like a funeral shroud. He didn't see the stunned faces or the chaos he left in his wake. All he could hear were the girl's words, echoing in the frantic, terrified chambers of his own mind. The chipped wing. How? How did she know? Judge Arthur Blackwell slammed the heavy oak door of his chambers, the sound echoing the turmoil in his own chest. The room, usually a sanctuary of quiet logic and ordered books, felt like a prison. He ripped at the collar of his shirt, the silk tie suddenly a chokehold. He was pacing, a caged animal, his polished shoes scuffing the immaculate floor. The girl's words were a relentless echo, replaying in his mind. The chipped wing. The chipped wing. He strode to the private washroom, turning on the cold tap and splashing water onto his face. He stared at his reflection in the mirror. The man looking back was not the unshakable Judge Blackwell. It was a stranger with wild, haunted eyes, his mask of control shattered into 1,000 pieces. Then the doubt began to creep in, a slow, cooling poison. His mind, a finely tuned instrument of logic and reason, rebelled against the impossible. It was a trick. It had to be. A leak. Someone on the inside, a clerk, a bitter cop, a courthouse rat, had seen the file and fed the information to the girl. It was a desperate theatrical gambit, and he had fallen for it. The thought calmed him, the familiar comfort of a rational explanation settling over the chaos. Fueled by this new resolve, he stalked back to his desk. He barked an order through his intercom, and within minutes, the bailiff brought the sealed evidence box for the Vargas case. With trembling hands, Blackwell untied the red ribbon and lifted the lid. He dug through photos and reports until he found it, the confidential forensics analysis. He flipped through the pages, his heart hammering against his ribs. Page 85, 86, 87. There it was, a single line in cold, black type. Initial analysis of wound suggests blade approximately 4 inches, possibly from a common steak knife. Note: a wood fragment found deep in the tissue contains an etching detail. Appendix C shows a microscopic image of what appears to be a bird's wing, with a clear fracture or chip at the tip. Seeing the words in print did not bring relief. It brought a fresh wave of horror. It was real. It wasn't a vague guess. It was a precise, impossible hit. The doubt began to recede, replaced by a profound and terrifying confusion. He picked up the phone, his hand shaking. He called Detective Miller, the lead investigator. The man's voice was tense, defensive. He swore on his badge that only 3 people had ever seen that specific report: himself, the lab technician, and the judge. There had been no leaks. There was no explanation. Next, he called the prosecutor, Harris, who was still reeling. Harris was speechless, offering nothing but panic theories that the judge instantly dismissed. Each phone call, each denial, chiseled away at his logical explanations until nothing was left. He was adrift in a desert of doubt, with no landmarks, no reason, no North Star to guide him. The certainty of the miracle in the courtroom began to feel like a mirage, a fever dream. Was he losing his mind? Had the years of grief finally fractured his sanity? He slumped into his leather chair, the weight of the mystery crushing him. The courtroom, his throne, his power. It all seemed like a distant memory. He was no longer a judge presiding over a case. He was a man haunted by a question he couldn't answer. How? The anger was gone, burned away by the fires of confusion. All that remained was a desperate, gnawing need. The question of Daniel Vargas's guilt or innocence was secondary now. It was a footnote. The only thing that mattered, the only thing in the world that could pull him from this abyss, was the girl, Lily. She wasn't a disruption to be dismissed anymore. She was the key. She was the only person on earth who had the answer. He buzzed the intercom again. His trusted bailiff, a stoic man named Peterson, entered the chambers. The judge looked up, his eyes filled with a desperate intensity Peterson had never seen before. "The girl," Blackwell said, his voice low and urgent. "The niece of the defendant. I want you to find her." "You want me to bring her in for questioning, Your Honor?" "No," Blackwell said, standing up. "This isn't official. This is for me. Find out where she lives. Find out who her parents are. Find everything you can. I need to speak with her, not as a judge, but as something else." Peterson nodded, his expression unreadable, and left the room. Blackwell was alone again, surrounded by the silent, mocking law books that had once been his religion. Hours bled into one another. Darkness fell outside his window. On his desk, the Vargas case file lay open. On a sudden, inexplicable impulse, he walked to a locked cabinet in the corner of the room. He keyed in the combination and pulled out a dusty, forgotten file, one he hadn't touched in years. The cover was faded, the label written in his own, younger handwriting. Eleanor Blackwell. Homicide investigation. Cold case. He placed the two files side by side on his polished desk. The case that had just broken his reality, and the case that had broken his life. They were two separate worlds, two different agonies. But as he stared at them under the pale glow of his desk lamp, a terrifying, electrifying thought sparked in the darkness of his mind. She had known about the chipped wing. What if she also knew something about Eleanor? The thought was insane. It was illogical. But it was also the only hope he had felt in a decade. The search for the girl was no longer just about the law. It was about his soul. The journey from the towering granite courthouse to Lily's neighborhood was a descent. Judge Blackwell sat in the back of his bailiff's car, watching as the pristine avenues of power gave way to cracked pavement and tired, struggling storefronts. The world through the tinted window was a place he judged but never truly saw, a foreign land of consequences. He had taken off his judicial robe, but he still felt its phantom weight, a cloak of authority that was useless here. He was not a judge on his way to an inquiry. He was a desperate man chasing a ghost. Peterson pulled up to a small, two-story apartment building with a faded brick facade. A child's bicycle lay on its side on a patchy lawn. For a moment, Blackwell hesitated. This was a line he had never crossed, leaving the sterile, predictable world of the law to step into the messy reality of a life he was about to upend. Lily's mother, a woman with weary eyes that held a flicker of fierce defiance, opened the door. She led him into a small, immaculately clean living room that smelled of laundry soap and simmering soup. Family photos crowded the mantelpiece. In this small space, filled with the artifacts of a life of struggle and love, Blackwell's presence felt like a violation, a bull in a china shop. Lily was sitting at a small wooden table, drawing. She looked up as he entered, her expression not of fear, but of patient expectation. Blackwell did not sit. He remained standing, a towering figure of intimidation, falling back on the only tool he had left. "I need answers," he said, his voice hard. "No more games. The knife. My wife. How do you know these things?" Lily set her crayon down. She didn't look at him, but at an old, framed photograph on the wall. It was of a younger, happier version of her mother, standing next to a proud-looking man with a bright, confident smile. "That is my father," she said, her voice soft but clear. "He used to be a lawyer, like you. He believed in the law, too." Blackwell's patience was wearing thin. "What does this have to do with anything?" "He was working on a big case a long time ago," Lily continued, her voice never wavering. "He found evidence that a very powerful businessman was building his empire with dirty money. My father was so proud. He was going to bring the man to justice." The judge stared at her, a cold knot forming in the pit of his stomach. A distant, buried memory was beginning to stir. "But the prosecutor on the case was very ambitious," Lily said, her eyes finally lifting to meet his. The look in them was not accusatory. It was worse. It was knowing. He didn't want a long, complicated trial that he might lose. He wanted a fast, easy conviction. So he made a deal. He buried my father's evidence to protect his perfect record. He let the powerful man go free. The room tilted. Blackwell felt the blood drain from his face. He remembered. He remembered it all. The case. The corrupt businessman, Marcus Thorne. The young, idealistic lawyer who had brought him the evidence. And he remembered himself, a young, ruthless prosecutor who saw the law not as a tool for justice, but as a ladder for his own ambition. He had crushed that man's case and his spirit without a second thought. "My father lost everything," Lily said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "His job, his reputation, his heart. My Uncle Daniel, the man in your courtroom, he has been supporting us ever since. He was the only thing holding our family together." Blackwell couldn't breathe. The pieces were clicking into place, each one a hammer blow to his soul. Marcus Thorne. Daniel Vargas. It couldn't be. "The man Uncle Daniel is accused of killing," Lily said, delivering the final, devastating blow. "He was Mr. Thorne's accountant. He found the same secrets my father did, and he was going to talk." It was all there. A straight, unbroken line from a single act of selfish ambition 20 years ago to the present moment. His sin hadn't just been a mistake, it was a seed of darkness that he had planted and which had grown into a poison tree, its branches now strangling everything he touched. He had not just failed to stop a criminal, he had created a monster. He had ruined Lily's father. He had put an innocent man on death row. He was not an arbiter of justice in this story. He was its original sinner. His quest for answers, for a miracle, for relief from his own grief, it all curdled into shame. He wasn't here seeking a cure. He was a murderer visiting the graves of his victims. He finally looked at Lily, at this small child who carried the weight of his sins. He saw the wisdom in her eyes was not a gift from heaven. It was the heavy, ancient knowledge of the wronged. The impossible information she held was not a miracle. It was a reckoning, and the bill had just come due. The confession hung in the air, a truth so heavy it seemed to bend the very light in the room. Judge Arthur Blackwell staggered back a step, his hand finding the edge of a bookshelf to steady himself. The strength fled his body, replaced by a chilling, hollowing weakness. He was no longer on his throne, looking down. He was at the bottom of a deep, dark well, looking up at the wreckage of a life he had personally destroyed. His entire career, a towering monument to his intellect and integrity, crumbled to dust in his mind. Every gavel strike, every sentence he had ever passed, now felt like a grotesque hypocrisy. He had preached justice from his bench, while the origins of his own success were rooted in a profound and selfish injustice. He thought of Eleanor, of the righteous anger he had carried for her, and a wave of searing shame washed over him. How dare he demand justice for his own pain when he had been the architect of so much suffering for others? He looked at Lily's mother, who was now standing by her daughter, her hand resting on her shoulder. The woman's face was a mask of sorrow, not of anger. She wasn't looking at him with hatred, but with a kind of pity that was 1,000 times more painful. The old Blackwell, the man of power and influence, made one last, desperate attempt to rise from the ashes. He cleared his throat, the sound rough and broken. "I can fix this," he said, the words sounding hollow and pathetic even to himself. "I have money, resources. I can hire the best lawyers, start an investigation." He was offering a checkbook to heal a mortal wound. Lily shook her head, a small, simple gesture that carried the force of a final judgment. "Money can't give my father back the man he was," she said, her voice soft but unwavering. "It can't erase the years of shame. It can't give Uncle Daniel back the time he has spent in a cage, waiting to die." Her words weren't a condemnation. They were a diagnosis. She was telling him that the disease he had spread couldn't be cured with the tools of his old life. Power, influence, wealth, they were all useless here. He was stripped bare, left with nothing but the devastating weight of his own actions. The last vestiges of his authority crumbled. The judge was gone, leaving only Arthur, a man drowning in guilt. He looked at the 10-year-old girl, his eyes pleading. The question left his lips in a choked whisper, the most honest sound he had made in 20 years. "What do I do?" The inversion was complete. The king was now kneeling at the feet of the peasant, begging for a map out of the wasteland he had created. He was no longer demanding answers. He was praying for absolution. Lily was not a child in that moment. She was a confessor, a guide. She looked at him with an unnerving calm, her simple wisdom cutting through the complexities of law and ego that had defined his entire life. She did not offer him comfort. She offered him the only path that was left. A lie is a monster, she said simply. You made this one a long time ago. You can't kill it by throwing money at it. You have to drag it out into the sunlight so everyone can see it for what it is. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle upon him. You have to tell the truth, the whole truth, the whole truth. The words echoed in the chambers of his heart. Not just the truth about Marcus Thorne being the real killer. Not just the truth about Daniel Vargas's innocence. His truth. The ugly, selfish secret of his own complicity. The story of how he, Arthur Blackwell, had sacrificed an innocent man's life for his own ambition. He nodded slowly, a silent, binding contract passing between them. He left the apartment a different man. His confident, purposeful stride was gone, replaced by the slow, heavy steps of someone carrying an immense burden. As he got into the car, Peterson, his bailiff, saw the change. The judge's face was pale, his eyes were hollow, and the arrogant fire that always burned in them had been extinguished. The man who had entered that building had been burned to the ground. As the car pulled away, weaving through the streets of the city he once believed he ruled, Blackwell stared unseeing at the passing lights. The path Lily had laid out for him was clear. It was a path of self-destruction. To expose the monster Marcus Thorne had become, he would have to do more than just present evidence. He would have to get on the stand, under oath, and confess everything. He would have to become the star witness in the demolition of his own life. To save Daniel Vargas, he had to destroy Judge Arthur Blackwell. The path to redemption began in the dead of night, in the tomb-like silence of Judge Blackwell's chambers. He worked under the solitary glow of a desk lamp, a man performing an autopsy on his own past. The dusty files from the 20-year-old Marcus Thorne case were spread before him, their brittle pages smelling of decay and buried lies. Every line he read, written in his own arrogant, youthful hand, was a fresh stab of guilt. He wasn't just reviewing a case. He was confronting the ghost of the man he used to be, and he despised him. He knew he couldn't walk this path alone. His own credibility was shot, a currency he had already spent on his ambition. He needed an ally, someone within the system who still believed in the justice he had so easily betrayed. After hours of consideration, he picked up the phone. He dialed the private number of Isabella Rossi, a young, tenacious assistant district attorney who had a reputation for being brilliant, fearless, and incorruptible. Their meeting was clandestine, held in a deserted parking garage, a setting fit for criminals, not officers of the court. Blackwell, humbled and stripped of his authority, laid out the whole ugly story. He spared no detail of his own corruption. Rossi listened, her expression shifting from disbelief to shock, and finally to a cold, determined anger. She agreed to help, to secretly begin building a new case against Thorne. For the first time in days, a fragile sliver of hope pierced through Blackwell's despair. But monsters do not sleep quietly. Marcus Thorne, a man who had built an empire on secrets and fear, had eyes and ears all over the city. A week after Blackwell's meeting with Rossi, a sleek black car pulled up beside him as he was leaving the courthouse. A man in a tailored suit got out and handed him a phone. Mr. Thorne would like a word. Blackwell took the phone, his hand steady. Thorne's voice was smooth, a venomous purr. "Judge," he began, the title dripping with mockery. "It has come to my attention that you've developed a sudden interest in ancient history. I would advise against it. Some things are better left buried." "It's over, Marcus," Blackwell said, his voice firm. A low chuckle came through the receiver. "Is it? I wonder. I also have an interest in history, Arthur. For instance, I was fascinated to learn about a certain period in your youth, a time when a promising young law student racked up some rather significant gambling debts that were mysteriously paid off by a man with very interesting business partners. Blackwell felt the blood freeze in his veins. He had been reckless once, a long time ago. A mistake he had buried and prayed would never see the light of day. I have documents, Arthur, Thorne continued, his voice hardening. Bank statements. Photos. Enough to ensure that when your career ends, it won't be with a quiet resignation. It will be a media firestorm. You won't just be a disgraced judge. You'll be a hypocrite, a fraud, a gambling addict who crawled into bed with the mob. Your name will be a joke for generations. This was the crossroads. The devil's bargain laid bare. Thorne was offering him an exit, a chance to retreat into the shadows, to let Daniel Vargas perish, and to preserve the last, tattered shred of his public dignity. His old self, the proud, arrogant man who cherished his legacy, screamed at him to take the deal. It was the voice of self-preservation, the voice that had guided him his entire life. To be ruined was one thing. To be utterly humiliated, a laughingstock, was another. He closed his eyes, and in the darkness, he saw Lily's face. He saw the quiet dignity of her family, the weary hope in her mother's eyes, the ghost of the brilliant lawyer her father could have been. He weighed the value of his pride against the value of their lives. He thought of his own name, a name he had once fought so hard to build, and realized with startling clarity that it was already worthless, tarnished not by what Thorne might reveal, but by what he himself had done. A man with nothing to lose is a free man. And Arthur Blackwell had already lost everything that mattered. He opened his eyes. The fear was gone. Are we clear, Arthur? Thorne's voice purred with confidence. Do we have an understanding? Blackwell looked up at the stone facade of the courthouse, the monument to a justice he had failed to serve. He thought of the truth, the whole truth, and the cleansing fire that was to come. He brought the phone back to his lips, his voice calm and steady, the voice of a man who had already passed sentence upon himself. You can't threaten a man who is already on his way to the gallows, Marcus. He said, leak whatever you want. It will all be part of the testimony. He ended the call and handed the phone back to the stun driver. The choice was made. The war had begun. The courtroom was a circus. Marcus Thorne, true to his word, had saturated the media with every sordid detail of Arthur Blackwell's past. The gallery was packed not just with lawyers and the public, but with television cameras and reporters, all of them sharks drawn to the blood in the water. They had come to witness the spectacular death of a legend, to feast on the carcass of a great man's reputation. And the man himself was there to serve them the meal. Arthur Blackwell did not walk to the judge's bench, his throne. He walked to the witness stand, a small wooden box of public scrutiny. As he sat, he could feel the hundreds of eyes on him, the judgment, the scorn. He saw Marcus Thorne in the front row, wearing a confident, predatory smile, flanked by a team of expensive lawyers. He saw Lily and her family, sitting quietly on the other side, their faces tense with a fragile, desperate hope. Thorne's lead attorney went first, his questions designed not to seek truth, but to assassinate character. He paraded Arthur's gambling debts before the court. He insinuated mob ties. He painted a picture of a corrupt, hypocritical fraud who was now lashing out with wild accusations to save himself. Through it all, Blackwell remained calm. He answered every question with a simple, unadorned yes. Yes, he had debts. Yes, they were paid off. He accepted the humiliation without protest, letting the waves of shame wash over him and pass. This was part of the price. The smug confidence on Thorne's face grew with every admission. Then it was Ada Rossi's turn. She stood, her gaze firm, and her first question changed the gravity of the entire room. Mr. Blackwell, she said, her voice clear and strong, I want to take you back 20 years, to the original investigation of Marcus Thorne. Please tell the court what you did. This was it, the moment of sacrifice. Arthur Blackwell took a deep breath, and for the first time in his entire career, he spoke the whole, unvarnished truth from a witness stand. He told them everything. He spoke of his own burning ambition, the pride that had blinded him to justice. He described in detail the evidence against Thorne that Lily's father had brought him, evidence that was irrefutable. And then, his voice steady, he confessed his own crime. I buried it, Blackwell said, his voice echoing in the stunned silence. I suppressed the evidence. I made a conscious choice to let a guilty man walk free because I valued my conviction record more than I valued the truth. The man whose life I ruined to do it was named David Miller, Lily's father. A collective gasp went through the courtroom. Thorne's smile vanished, replaced by a mask of pure fury. My actions did not just deny justice, Blackwell continued, his eyes finding Lily's. They created a monster. My sin of ambition allowed Marcus Thorne to operate without fear for 2 decades. And that path, which I myself paved, led him directly to the crime for which an innocent man, Daniel Vargas, was about to be executed. He had stripped himself bare, confessing not just his actions, but the moral rot at their core. He had sacrificed his name, his career, and his freedom on the altar of truth. And with every word spoken, he felt a crushing weight he hadn't even realized he was carrying begin to lift. The ghost of his pride, the heavy chains of his guilt, they were dissolving in the cleansing fire of his confession. He was no longer a judge, no longer a powerful man. He was just Arthur. And for the first time in a very long time, he was free. When he finished, a profound silence held the room. It was the silence of a truth, so absolute it left no room for argument. The presiding judge, a woman known for her own stern demeanor, stared at Blackwell for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she turned her gaze, hard as diamonds, toward a pale and sweating Marcus Thorne. She raised her gavel, not Blackwell's, but her own. She struck it once, the sound a clean, sharp crack that signaled the end of an era and the beginning of a new one. Based on the sworn testimony of a former federal judge, she announced, her voice ringing with authority, this court finds sufficient cause. I am issuing a warrant for the immediate arrest of Mr. Marcus Thorne on suspicion of murder and conspiracy. Chaos erupted. Cameras flashed as bailiffs moved toward a stunned Thorne. But the judge wasn't finished. She struck her gavel again, silencing the room. Furthermore, she declared, looking toward the defense table, all charges against Mr. Daniel Vargas are hereby dismissed. This man is to be released from his chains and set free. Immediately, across the courtroom, Arthur saw a guard unlocking the shackles from Daniel Vargas's wrists. He saw Lily's mother sobbing, not with grief, but with overwhelming relief. He saw Lily, who was not looking at her uncle, but at him. And for the first time, he saw her smile. The liberation was complete. The aftermath of the storm was quiet. Arthur Blackwell sat not in his chambers, but in a small, gray room with a metal table, stripped of his title, his reputation, and his freedom. He was no longer a judge. He was a suspect, waiting to be processed for the crime of obstructing justice. Yet, in this sterile box, he felt a sense of peace that his opulent chambers had never provided. He had given up everything, and in doing so had finally unburdened his soul. Through a small, reinforced window, he could see a television in the hallway, the sound muted. A news report was showing the scene outside the courthouse. He saw Daniel Vargas walk out, a free man, his face etched with disbelief and overwhelming relief. He watched as Daniel fell into the arms of his family, a raw, emotional reunion that needed no sound to be understood. He saw Lily's mother weeping, her body shaking with years of pent-up grief and fear, now released in a flood of catharsis. That was the healing of the body, the mending of a family that his actions had torn apart. It was a direct, tangible result of his sacrifice, a physical manifestation of a spiritual debt being paid. This was the justice that truly mattered. Later, ADA Rossi entered the room. She spoke to him not with anger, but with a quiet professionalism. She laid out the consequences. He would be disbarred, prosecuted, and would almost certainly serve time in prison. Arthur listened, nodding slowly. He felt no fear, no despair. He accepted it all. It was not a punishment, but a penance. The final, necessary step on the path to becoming whole. I have one question, Arthur said, his voice calm. The girl, Lily, how did she know about my wife? Rossi sighed, pulling a file from her briefcase. It wasn't a ghost, Arthur. It was just a truth that wouldn't die. After you ruined his career, Lily's father never stopped investigating Marcus Thorne. It became his obsession. Years ago, he uncovered an old insurance claim from one of Thorne's shell corporations. It was a payout for a sedan that was reported stolen, then found wrecked and abandoned on the very night of your wife's death, not 5 miles from a scene. It was a loose thread, a piece of a puzzle he had never had. Lily's father had told his family the story, a whisper of a suspicion that he could never prove. But Lily, with a child's simple, unwavering conviction, had held onto that whisper. Her power wasn't magic. It was the inherited weight of a father's righteous obsession, a truth passed down until it found a voice brave enough to speak it. Before he was transferred, he had one last visit. It was Lily and her mother. There were no tears, no grand speeches. Lily's mother simply looked at him, her eyes clear for the first time. "Thank you," she said, "not for being a hero, but for finally telling the truth." Lily stepped forward and placed a folded piece of paper on the table. She said nothing. After they left, Arthur unfolded it. It was a child's drawing, done in crayon. It depicted a large, majestic eagle, soaring high in a blue sky. And on its right wing, where there had once been a chip, there was now a small, brightly colored bandage. The healing was complete. 3 years later, the gates of a low-security correctional facility opened, and Arthur Blackwell walked out into the bright morning sun. He was thinner, grayer, and the lines on his face were deeper, but they were no longer lines of stress and authority. They were lines of acceptance. He owned nothing but the simple civilian clothes on his back and the drawing of the eagle, which he kept tucked in his pocket. He expected to walk to the bus station alone, but waiting for him, leaning against a modest car, was a man he hadn't seen in 25 years. It was David Miller, Lily's father. The man's hair was graying, but the bright, confident smile from the old photograph had returned to his eyes. He was no longer a ghost. There was a long moment of silence between them, the air thick with the weight of their shared history. It was David who broke it. "I reopened my practice," he said, his voice even. "Well, it's more of a non-profit clinic now. We help people who get chewed up by the system, people who can't afford lawyers." Arthur simply nodded, unsure of what to say. "The thing is," David continued, a small smile playing on his lips, "we have too many cases and not enough good researchers. I need someone with a brilliant legal mind who understands how the system works from the inside. Someone who knows how to find the truth, no matter how deeply it's buried. The pay is terrible." He extended his hand. It was not an offer of pity. It was an offer of forgiveness, of purpose. It was a chance to build a new life from the rubble of the old one. Arthur looked at the outstretched hand, and for the first time since his wife's death, he felt the warmth of grace. He shook it. His new throne was a cluttered desk in the back of a noisy, underfunded legal aid office. His new robe was a worn-out sweater. His new gavel was a red pen, which he used to circle inconsistencies in police reports and find hope for the hopeless. He worked tirelessly, not for ambition, not for legacy, but for the simple, profound satisfaction of helping another human being. He was finally serving justice, not just pronouncing it. One afternoon, he looked up from a particularly difficult case file. Through the window of the small office, he saw David arriving with Lily, now a bright-eyed teenager, who was volunteering at the clinic for the summer. He watched his father and daughter laugh together, their bond unbreakable, their future bright. Arthur Blackwell smiled, a real, peaceful smile that reached his eyes. The king was dead. The man had been reborn. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to see more exciting videos like this one. Leave a like to support us and turn on notifications so you don't miss anything new. This helps us continue to create the best for you. See you in the next video.